You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 61, with special guest David Burnett. I'm your layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Mike Heiser. How are you, Mike?
Very good. Very good. Excited to have Dave on.
Yeah, we're our second interview, so this is going to be fun.
Yeah, well, let's just jump right into it. Dave, you there, I trust?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. I'm going to do what we did with Ron Johnson, essentially. If we could start out by sort of you introducing yourself to the audience, you know, who you are, what you do, and then how you got tangled up with me. You know, how you got drawn into this mess, you know, all this divine counsel mess. Just a little recapturing of the history here.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So my name's David Burnett. I'm a teaching pastor at Arthur City Baptist Church in Texas, and I am finishing my MATBS thesis in Old Testament interpretation, and I have a BA in biblical studies. And I met Mike years ago. How long has it been now, Mike? 8 years ago?
It's pushing 10, so 8 sounds right.
Yeah, about 9 years ago, I guess. It was in my undergrad. And I had taken a class on Jewish apocalyptic literature, canonical and non-canonical, with Dr. Daniel Street, who's now at HBU. And we were getting into the hierarchy of angels, and I was getting really excited and interested in it and hearing all kinds of weird things I'd never heard before. And I was asking him what are the best scholars on this issue. And he says that he thinks the best background for this is the divine counsel in the Old Testament, and he sent me to Mike's website. And so I got on Mike's website, and I was enthralled. I read just about I literally read everything on his website, and I was just that was it. And so that year was my first year to go to ETS, the Evangelical Theological Society, and Mike was giving a paper on the ancient Israelite Godhead, and he was the chair of that session. And I was really excited to meet him and hear his paper. And so I went to his paper and listened and had some questions afterwards and was getting excited and introduced myself to Mike after the session and said, you know, I've read everything on your website. I've been thinking about these things. I'm making all these connections. What about this text? What about this text? And Mike's excited that I'm excited, and met Ron Johnson.
Someone's paying attention.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And Ron Johnson was there, and met him, and then we all had dinner that evening, and I got to hang out with you guys and your wives, and it was a great dinner, and just kind of told the story of where I've come from and where they've come from, and just, man, we've just been talking about text and interpretation ever since.
Well, I have good memories of that too. I mean, we can joke about it. I mean, Dave wasn't the only one to come to hear the paper.
Well, yeah.
Sometimes, you get the impression that things can be so obscure, or since, as my listeners, of course, know, this isn't the kind of thing that you'd encounter on the normal beaten path within evangelicalism. That I often get email, am I the only one? Are other people really, tell me, confirm to me that other people are really interested in this, and they are. They come out of the woodwork. They hear something and they pursue it. They have the passion for it. They see the value of it, and Dave's a good example of that. It just happened to be at an academic conference. So yeah, that's a familiar story, but obviously one I have a real good memory of as well. What if you can sort of elaborate on kind of your journey since that point? What after we met, and after again you started really pouring yourself into this, you began to develop your own research interests. So if you could describe some of those for people, I think they'd find it very interesting.
So yeah, I came at this topic through the back door. I was really into the study of Paul, and I got into the new perspective in my undergrad and began to really get into Jewish backgrounds, and read a lot of apocalyptic literature and a lot of the weird apocalypses of heavenly journeys and revelations and all these things, and began to see that this was kind of long developed idea that has had lots of reception history to it, and started making the connections with the divine council stuff to the apocalyptic stuff, and then into the New Testament. And in Paul, I was studying Romans, and I was reading Romans 4, and just reading over what Paul has to say about the Abrahamic covenant, the way he reads it. And he mentions in 4:13 that the promise to Abraham and his seed is that he would be heir of the cosmos. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't remember that in Genesis. And so where is Paul?
Or Sunday school, right?
Yeah, I don't. Abraham promised the cosmos. I remember him promised the land of Israel and the multiplication of seed, but I don't remember him being promised the whole cosmos. And so that made me dig, and Paul's connecting all sorts of ideas in Romans 4 there that he reads all out of Genesis 15, and it made me start this kind of research path where are all these ideas coming from? And just so happens that the divine counsel piece or element to this interpretation of Genesis 15 I found when I wasn't really looking for it. I stumbled upon it and realized that, in the Old Testament, which is common in ancient Near Eastern literature, is this whole concept of the stars as the astral hosts, as the heavenly hosts, or the even called the sons of God. And it's this common idea in the ancient world that the stars, as we would call them stars, kokavim in Hebrew probably just means shining ones or burning ones. I just translate them as celestial bodies in my research, but they are actually beings in the heavens in their cosmology. And important to that idea is I found in Deuteronomy is that Deuteronomy 4 especially. I'm sure many of your listeners are aware of the Deuteronomy 32 stuff because I've heard y'all talk about that. But specifically, that language in Deuteronomy 32 is in Deuteronomy 4 as well, in the passage of about aniconism, where Yahweh is telling Moses not to make any graven images, not of man, woman, beasts of the field, birds of the heavens. And then he says, look to the heavens and see all the sun, the moon, the stars. And he calls them all the Savaot, all the hosts of heaven. He says, don't be carried away and worship them, those that were allotted to the peoples under the whole heavens. And that was, I didn't know what to do with that text. I was like, is this in my Old Testament? Because I don't remember hearing about this text.
Yeah, it sounds like like Psalm 82 was sort of a watershed.
Oh, yeah.
Passage for me. So this is where you're tracking.
Yeah, I had already been exposed. This was post being exposed to Mike's work in the Deuteronomy 32 worldview and connecting it with Psalm 82. But then when I looked through Deuteronomy and I wanted to study Deuteronomy more and kind of understand the Shema in relation to these ideas, understand Deuteronomy's understanding of the gods of the nations and how Deuteronomy articulates them. And what was interesting was in Deuteronomy 4, you have this language of halak or allotment of the peoples that comes up in 32, but in Deuteronomy 4, it's talking about the astral host, the sun, moon, stars. Mm-hmm. And so where in Deuteronomy 32 is the sons of God. And then in 17, of course, you have the mention of the gods of the nations, gods that were not allotted to you. And so this trajectory led me back into this whole idea connected with Genesis 15, when the word of Yahweh takes Abram outside in a vision. It's very important. This is a vision sequence, and takes him outside and shows him the stars and says, number the stars. If you can number them, so shall your seed be. And in this promise, what I found, and this was completely accidental, I wasn't really looking for it. I assumed that somewhere in there, Paul is reading that promise as that being promised to be like the heavenly hosts, to be like the stars in the sense of qualitatively, not just quantitatively.
Mm-hmm.
And so that I had a hunch that I was right about this, and I started digging through the Second Temple material, and lo and behold, I found multiple readings of that in the Second Temple period, as I had suspected, in Philo, in Apocalypse of Abraham, more than likely in Sirach, the Greek reading of Wisdom ben Sirach. So I'm finding in these texts this tradition of reading it that way. So for texts from Palestinian apocalypses to Alexandrian philosophers. So it seems to be a wide-ranging tradition of reading the text this way. And it lined up perfectly with this whole divine council tradition. And I was fascinated, and I ended up writing a paper on it and submitting it for a conference at HBU on Paul and Judaism last year. And it was accepted, and I presented it there, and it got great feedback and sparked some great conversations. And immediately after, I had submitted the paper to SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, for the national meeting in San Diego. When I first submitted it, it was rejected, and the Pauline epistles section is a difficult section to get accepted into, and so I was expecting that. But then I got an email a few days later where they said that they were going to, because of the amount of great submissions that they had, they were going to open a second session, and it was going to be a joint session with all the Pauline epistles groups meeting together, and it was going to be a panel session where they have 3 respondents. And so they said, if you'd like to resubmit, you can. And of course I did, not expecting for it to be accepted, because I haven't even started my PhD yet. I figure they're probably not going to let a student member present on this, but I guess it had got enough traction and some folks heard about it and they ended up accepting it. And turns out the readers, the respondents to my paper there at SBL were N.T. Wright, Pamela Eisenbaum, and Ward Blanton, and it went over really well.
I was there for, we ought to get into that a little bit because Ron, I don't know if you listened to the interview with Ron. Yeah, Ron made the observation that how much he appreciates N.T. Wright, and I think we all appreciate N.T. Wright and what he's produced. But he had this little element of frustration. If N.T. Wright only knew about the divine council worldview, this part of his argument over here would be strengthened and would help him address certain things that he's been criticized for. And that actually was how I felt listening to your paper and his response to your paper, because it became evident to me really quickly that he just did not have the framework, the Old Testament framework, to really process what you were saying. And I was pleasantly surprised. You can tell us if you were surprised by this, but I was pleasantly surprised that you had, there were probably 3 or 4, people in the audience that just chimed in right away in your defense in the Q&A.
Yeah, I actually, Mike, that whole SBL experience was kind of backwards for me, actually, because I had been really interested in the study of theosis in Paul for quite some time. The idea of deification, that the promise goal of sanctification in Paul was the idea of becoming like God or like the gods. And I had read a lot of great literature on this. But I saw no one making these connections with the Old Testament. So I'm thinking, that Wright was going to be my biggest proponent because he supports the idea of theosis in Paul, and I thought that by bringing the Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern framework to bear on the conversation, that it would only, highlight those ideas and give them the depth of background that I think is actually where Paul's deriving these ideas, along with other Second Temple Jews. And so I expected him to be all for it, while I wasn't too sure about Eisenbaum and Blanton. I thought I might get some pushback from them. And it was quite the opposite. Yeah. I remember Pamela Eisenbaum very kindly saying that I had convinced her that this is how Paul was reading it. And she told me afterwards that this is something that needed to be published, and Pauline scholars need to deal with this because no one's talked about this. And so I had mentioned to her that the paper has been solicited for the Journal of Study of Paul and His Letters. And so I'm just waiting to hear back from the editorial board about that to see what journal it'll come out in. But then, like you said, during the Q&A time, just leading up to that, Wright had actually pushed back and had disagreed with my premise. And, in kind and polite British fashion, saying that it was an ingenious proposal, but I just disagree with your premise. And he was of the persuasion, and the contention is really important here, though. His contention was that I was mistaking metaphor with metonymy, and that the astralization passages that you're well aware of, Mike, in Second Temple period, as they relate to resurrection, say in texts like First Enoch and Second Baruch, etc. These texts that read the resurrection in astral terms, coming out of Daniel 12, that in the resurrection they will shine as the stars of heaven. There's a wide-ranging tradition in the Second Temple period that reads it that way in apocalyptic Judaism, which I would consider early Christianity within those strands. Of reading it that way, he says that all of those texts are metaphoric. That in his reading, especially in his Resurrection of the Son of God book, the massive tome on the resurrection, when he deals with those texts, he treats them all as metaphoric readings, like the stars is simply a metaphor, and you're mistaken on this. But the rest of the Second Temple scholars were behind me on this. And other Christian scholars as well. One of the scholars that stood up immediately to my defense was Brant Petrie from Notre Dame, and he pointed out in 1 Corinthians 15 the language of orani, or heavenly ones, that's used, or celestial bodies even, that's used in the Old Testament to talk about the celestial bodies, is what Paul calls the resurrected ones. And so this language of resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15 uses astral terminology that would be used for the astral beings of the Old Testament, and uses it for the resurrected faithful.
Yeah, that's really tricky. If you're gonna approach it like Wright does, when you start saying, well, all this is metaphorical, and then that, the fact of that connection in 1 Corinthians 15, Wright, of course, isn't going to say, well, the resurrection is a metaphor. I mean, he's going to affirm that Paul's talking about a genuine resurrection, but then he's sort of trapped, in that assumption of his that this is all just metaphorical language. Well, how does that work? Metaphorical language, but yet you're affirming the reality of this? I mean, how explain that? So it seems to me like he's boxed in there a little bit.
Yeah. It's kind of ironic to me because, here's the part that I expected actually from him that he responded about was he felt that too strong of a focus on the astralization language would be reading the resurrection as a non-bodily phenomena, that they would just become spirits in the resurrection, and it would be more of a Gnostic view and not more of a this earthly kind of new creation, hard, fleshly type of resurrection. And so because he has that kind of apologetic considerations, it's difficult to talk about these issues, because when you're not bringing in the divine counsel background to this, and then only looking at it from the perspective of, well, I have to defend the bodily resurrection, things can get mixed up. And some scholars that I think are really helpful here, and Wright did mention one of them briefly, but in terms of the astral resurrection is still bodily, is a scholar by the name of Troels Ensberg Peterson, who's done a lot of work on Paul and Stoicism, and Paul and the Stoics, and reading them comparatively, and especially Paul's cosmology and ethics, and even his ontology frequently uses the language of Stoicism. And he makes a good point here. And another scholar that has a book coming out that I'm really looking forward to is Matthew Thiessen at St. Louis University, who has a book coming out on Paul and the Gentile problem. And he has a whole chapter dealing with this. And he's actually cited my forthcoming article a couple of times. And I've had conversations with him about this. They both point out that, for example, the 1 Corinthians 15 passage, Paul, when he talks about a pneumatic body, a spirited body, or a spiritual body, as it's translated often, he does not mean a non-bodily corporeal body,
Right.
or incorporeal body. He does not mean a floating around spirit like the way modernists think of spirit. That he's thinking that the spirit is actually substance. It's the substance of the astral beings of heaven, the gods or the angels. This is the substance that they are made out of.
Yeah, whatever that stuff is, that's what we will be.
Right. That's what pneuma is for
and
Paul.
Even without appealing to scholars, I mean, I can remember in my own church context, hearing sermons about the resurrected Jesus. Okay, he shows up in the upper room, and apparently he's just there. Doesn't need to go through a door. Doesn't need to knock. He's the whole kind of passing through the walls, sort of thing. And yet he's very corporeal. I mean, he eats after the resurrection. He tells Thomas, "Hey, put your fingers here in the holes." And I mean, so even on a popular level, this notion of corporality does not, and really historically, hasn't been thought to conflict with this otherworldliness, because that's not a normal human body.
Right.
It doesn't have blood. There's something going on there, and it does surprise me that Wright, if it is, I'll use the word, is sort of fearful to talk about the one aspect, the otherworldly aspect, sort of shunting off the astral talk for the sake of affirming the corporeal talks, cutting off your nose to spite your face, kind of thing.
Right.
Where you don't really have to make that choice. So anyway,
right. And
that's just what popped into my head,
No, that's good.
Said that.
I think you hit the nail on the head there, because what we're talking about, the Old Testament and ancient Near Eastern background for this is essential, because when we think of the nature of the gods, and Paul even uses the language in 1 Corinthians 15 of perishable versus imperishable, like flesh and blood, that's when Paul puts flesh and blood against spirit in some sort of like dichotomy, it doesn't mean bodily and unbodily. It means one is perishable, one isn't.
Right.
That's really all he means.
Right.
The perishable must be taken off. This imperishable substance is put on. And so it's still substantive, it's still bodied, it's still embodied, it's still substantive, but it would be the substance
more than human.
of the gods. Yes.
Yeah.
That humans in their truest, resurrected, glorified form are like the bodies of the gods. They are completely immortal and imperishable.
Have you read David Litwa's book on this?
I've read most of it, yes.
Okay, he has an article and actually a pretty lengthy chapter on this. I'm wondering if that was any help.
Yeah, it was help. And We Are Being Transformed, the monograph that he did with Walter de Gruyter. That was very helpful, and I love his monograph. I think it's an amazing treasure trove of source material. I mean, he's done an extensive research on deification in Paul. But what I was fascinated about, and I mentioned this in the Q&A at SBL, was in Litva's work, not one time in his whole section on astralization does he mention the interpretation of Genesis 15. Not once.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing.
And I was like, otherwise, I can sing nothing but praises about that book. But I was just kind of flabbergasted. I was like, well, I'm looking at multiple Jewish Greek texts right in front of me that reference this astral reading of Genesis 15, and not one of them is mentioned. And I talked to Litva briefly after that session and mentioned that to him, and he thought it was interesting, and hopefully I'll be able to dialogue with him more in the future. But that was fascinating to me, and I'm glad the hole's there because I'm going to fill it. So,
well, just for the sake of the listener, I mean, the point that we're making here is that if you put some of these scholars in a room with Josephus and Philo and a few other people, and Josephus and Philo more or less just sort of shut up and listen to them talk about theosis and deification and all this, and they never would have heard Genesis 15:7. They would have butted in and said, hold on a minute, fellas, you're missing a really fundamental passage,
right?
And that we've talked about a lot. What gives? Why? How did you miss this?
Right. And it's Genesis 15:5. I did hear you say that on the previous podcast. 15:5, so shall your seed be. But this is, I'm really not sure how it's missed, because it really does plug up all the kind of exegetical issues with all of the content that Paul, for example, is packing into Genesis 15. Because there's a lot of content that in Romans 4 that a lot of exegetes have had a very difficult time explaining, and almost seeing as kind of disparate, disconnected ideas. That when Paul says that the promise to Abraham is to inherit the cosmos, he also says that he relates it to the idea of God bringing something out of nothing. So the whole creation idea, bringing life from the dead, the resurrection, and becoming the father of many nations. And he piles all of this into the content of the promise that was made in Genesis 15 to Abraham. And so how do you fit resurrection in there, inheriting nations in there, inheriting cosmos in there, like new creation type event in there? How do you get it all in there? And this, I mean, because otherwise you're saying, man, Paul is doing some insane exegetical moves here. But if you see this piece, I think it's a missing element that a lot of scholars, because they don't really understand the divine counsel context, they miss these elements.
Yeah, well, naturally you're preaching to the choir here. I mean, I would certainly agree, and it is, this isn't the only case. I mean, I've shared with people in the podcast, on the blog, it's kind of startling what you see seasoned scholars miss. And it's not a question of, we're smart and they're not. It's just that they're not paying attention, especially if they're New Testament or Second Temple. I mean, there's only so much time that they have to devote to whatever it is they're focused on. And so they don't often, get directed by something they read to the Old Testament and specifically to this aspect of Old Testament biblical theology. And even if they do, they don't have the luxury necessarily of camping on it, and really sort of going to town on it, and having it make a difference. But of course you did that, and, it's just paid off. I want to get your take just on a general question.
Sure.
Because I do get asked this question a lot. It'd be kind of interesting for people to hear what you think about it. But what is the value of reading non-canonical material from the Second Temple period? In other words, if somebody in church comes up to you, and you probably have had this happen at some point, why should I spend any time reading that? Give me a reason for caring as a layperson, as somebody who's not a scholar. Why should I sort of dive into that?
Right. That's a really, really important question for Protestants. Well, for starters, there's so many answers I want to give to this, but I'm going to try to summarize it in just a couple. The first one I would say is because a lot of the apocryphal literature that we call is the Apocrypha or deuterocanonical texts that Catholics and Episcopals and Orthodox still have in their Bibles were in all of the early Christian codexes. And so they were part of this literature. They predated the New Testament, and they show the reception history of the Old Testament in the period between the Testaments, which is really not the best denotation for that period. It's not intertestamental, it's Second Temple. But in that Second Temple period, it shows how faithful Jews are reading their Old Testament and interpreting it. And that reception history is really important because that's the highways leading into the New Testament.
Yeah, it's not like the New Testament readers would have just looked at that material and said, oh, well, this is the way these guys are reading it. Let's do something totally different.
Right. Because I think a lot of the kind of the lay assumption is that you have these silent years, from the end of Malachi, which is only in the end of the Protestant canon, not the Jewish canon. But at the end of Malachi, and then you have this great silence, and then boom, Matthew. And I think what happened, why that's so detrimental to our understanding of the New Testament often is we're not finding some of these concepts in the New Testament that would have been normative in the Judaisms of the period. We're not seeing it. And we see some of these things as unique or unexplainable. And when in reality, they have a very deep background in this literature. For example, the apocalyptic tradition, a lot of the language in the New Testament of revealing the righteousness of God and beholding Jesus enthroned in heaven and a journey to the third heavens and the whole book of Revelation. I mean, it kind of assumes this kind of dialectic with and conversation with apocalyptic literature of the day and apocalyptic genre of the day. And Christianity, earliest Christianity, which I think is kind of an anachronistic term when we're talking about New Testament, but when we talk about the earliest Christianity that we see in the New Testament, this is really to be read in concert with apocalyptic strands of Judaism of the time.
It's not like, I mean, I often, go out to events or whatever, or on the podcast, you get questions like, why haven't I ever heard this before? Well, a first century Jew would never say that.
Exactly.
Anyone who's literate, among the earliest Christians, they would have inherited a lot of these ideas that we talk about, divine counsel stuff in the Old Testament. That would have just been part of their frame of reference, just by default,
right.
Because they have this continuity, with the Old Testament on into the Second Temple period, and now we're here in the first century, and we're talking about apostles and the resurrected Jesus and all this stuff. Well, they would have never looked at you, or looked at me, if we were back there in time, and said, well, where are you getting that? Why haven't we ever heard this before? They would have heard it a lot.
Right. I use the common metaphor that many pastors use hermeneutically, but ironically don't apply it to the study of this Second Temple literature, is the whole idea of someone digging up a letter I write to Mike or Trey about, hey, you want to come to my Super Bowl party? The Cowboys are playing the Giants. See you later, whatever. And someone digs up that letter 2,000 years later and sees terms like Super Bowl, and you have the ancient English philologist doing studies on what Super Bowl means. And
the word super used in different contexts.
Exactly. We know this means very large or great in size, and we know that bowl is a kind of utensil they put food in. And so it must be a very large bowl. And we know that cowboys are these figures that rode on these ancient extinct animals that have 4 legs called horses. And you would make all sorts of exegetical fallacies if you're reading the text that way. And so the common idioms and the norms that simply by hearing a word or an idea, that all these things come to mind. When we say the term Super Bowl, I mean, a million things flood your mind instantly.
Right,
because of
baggage,
the norms of language. I mean, you're thinking pads, football, helmets, commercials, stadiums. You're thinking all kinds of things in an instant. And we have to, getting into that Second Temple literature isn't to say that we hold it at equal level with the canon, or we think it's lost scriptures that we need to read is equal to the Gospels. It has nothing to do with that. We're reading that literature so that we can better understand in Judaism, because that's what early Christianity is. It's still Judaism, that we want to understand the norms of language of that period, the way that they are reading their Old Testaments, the way their exegetical traditions, not our own, because they're 2,000 years removed. And so we want to understand those traditions so that we can actually hear some of these little allusions and little mentions of ideas that we may not understand or have any sort of background for, and that literature helps us fill in a lot of those gaps.
Yeah, I usually just tell people when I get the canon question, I understand why you're asking, I understand why a lot of people assign importance to the question, but it's hard for me to even care about it, because I don't have to see a book as canonical to know that it has value.
Right.
And to know that it informed a New Testament writer. So sure, if I get to heaven someday and God comes to me and says, Mike, about Enoch, you were wrong there. That should have been in there. I'm not going to care. I don't think I'm going to have that conversation.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't care if I did. And I don't even process the question that way. It's like, I know, for instance, again, taking Enoch, in probably the most obvious connection, I know that Peter and Jude read this material because it informs what they write. So that is sort of a hint or a clue that maybe I ought to go read that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I can process better, what's going on.
Yeah, and that goes back to the first thing I was saying about this literature is the Peter and Jude references, I think, are really important, because what they show is not only are they reading this Enochic reading of Genesis, but the Enochic readings of Genesis are seeing things implicitly within Genesis that we may not see. because
Right.
we don't have those ancient eyes. And because we might read the Enochic tradition and the Enochic text like First Enoch, and think, this is crazy. Where are they getting all this weird giant stuff and angels teaching them alchemy, and what the heck is going on with all this? Well, and what's the connection with Sodom and Gomorrah and angels coming down? So it's interesting there. You see the connection between Genesis 6 and angels, or heavenly beings, having sexual relations with women, and then connecting it with the Sodom and Gomorrah stories where angels are coming down and the men want to take them and know them. And these ancient texts are seeing these connections and reading the stories together, where the narrative of Genesis itself recapitulates itself and reads these stories together. And these ancient texts help us see these kinds of connections that may be implicit in Genesis already that we may not have noticed, that they notice and they make us aware of. And what you'll find is you'll find all sorts of texts that are reading traditions that way. And then, into the New Testament with the Peter and Jude, connecting the Watchers tradition with the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so it's like this, they're seeing literature of the Old Testament differently than we are. Mm-hmm. And that's what that literature is so helpful for, is to start to begin to read the Old Testament in ways that we've never read it before.
Well, that's good. I mean, I think the more we try to communicate that to people, whether the question surfaces directly or not, I think it is really valuable, because again, you and I we both preach this, to our respective audiences,
Right.
This whole notion of, let's do more than pay lip service to this idea of reading scripture in context.
Yes.
Okay. When we talk about context, we're not talking about evangelicalism or, some narrow evangelical sub-tradition or the Reformation or the Puritans or whatever. It's the context that produced the stuff.
Right.
And that, to us, obviously, because we're down this road a considerable ways, that has reached the point of being a self-evident thing.
Right.
And I'm not saying it isn't, because I sincerely think it is a self-evident thing that, whatever context produced something, that's the one you need to understand to process the thing produced. That just makes abundant sense. That's logical coherence at its simplest. But yet people, again, they're not trained to do that. And so when you bring up primary sources that aren't connected to the Bible at the level of inspiration, you get, people look at you like, you're asking me to do what? You're suggesting I read what?
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense to them. So I think it's real helpful, to the way you framed it, to say this helps us read a given text the way they would have read it and notice things that they noticed. And that's important, because we become more like them. Our minds become trained to process the information more closely to the way their minds would have processed it.
Right.
And that's one of the ways, we can sort of try to recover that context, to have, like I like to say, to have the Israelite in your head.
Yeah.
That's really what you need. Let me ask you this. Do you, and if you do, how do you communicate not only these sorts of recommendations in terms of Bible study to the people at the church where you pastor, but are you able to communicate any of what I'll loosely refer to as divine counsel, worldview content in your sermons? And if you do that, give us some examples. How have you tried to do that? Where has it worked? Where has it not worked? If you don't, what's the hesitation? I mean, where are you at in terms of someone who is trying to help people understand Scripture really the best way that they can, try to put some of these things within their reach?
Right. Yeah. I've actually done that quite a bit. And it's one of those things where, I'm not a big proponent of the normativity of this, but I do teach expositionally at my church, teach through books of the Bible. And I think, I'm not saying that every pastor should do this. I'm not out preaching a method here, but I'm saying that that's what I've found to be most helpful in reorienting minds into what these texts actually mean, is to read the whole text in its entirety, no matter how long it takes us. Mm-hmm. And I've spent just inordinate amount of time in these texts. And so what I've done at my church, for example, in teaching through, let's say we spent about 3 years and 2 months teaching through the Gospel of Luke. And reason why we spent so long in it is because every single Old Testament allusion, quotation, important background material I would dig into and teach them about. And I would really keep it in a narrative mode, keep it in a storied mode where they understand how this fits into that world. But in order to construct that world, we'd go back into the Old Testament text that Luke may be alluding to or outright quoting, and read that text within its context, and then see how it's received sometimes in later Old Testament texts, or maybe in some Second Temple texts even, and then go back to Luke and see that there's been a life to this text. There's been a tradition behind it, and then when you read the Luke text first and you don't have it, and then you go back to the beginning and read forward, I close again with that Luke text, and you see these light bulbs and eyes like wide open, like, wow, all that is in there. And it's, it's an amazing ride, and it's eye-opening. And so I take them through it kind of in a narrative mode, walk them through it pastorally. And the divine counsel context has kind of been shoved in there over long periods of time. At some points, I would take a break and say, okay, this Sunday we're going to look at the whole kind of background of this one idea before we go back to Luke, and I would do that. And so the divine counsel thing has been a constant
touch point
that has built on over the years. And so they're probably, a lot of them may know, Deuteronomy 32, that's Song of Moses. I know what that is about. I know what, Psalm 82. Yeah, I know what that's about, and it's part of it's actually incorporated into the eschatology of my church, and they would even use those terms. They would just kind of know it secondarily, like, oh yeah, of course, the demise of the powers of heaven means that the real exalted humanity gets the world back, And so it's just kind of part of their theological toolbox, and it's a lot of the times implicit, sometimes explicit. But again, this is something that I've had to do over long periods of time. It's something that is not just dumped in your face, like, here's all this stuff, everything you believed is nonsense. That's childish. And I think a lot of young students who have these huge paradigm shifts just want to run in Sunday school and just dump it on their people, and it's like, you gotta walk people through this stuff. They don't have the same education that you have. And so, a lot of patience and a lot of kind of building the context narratively, taking your time and walking them through it. And even having what I've found to be really helpful with this kind of material, like incorporating this material, is, we in our church, we have a Sunday morning service and then a Sunday evening service. And in some of my Sunday evening services, we do this like once a month. Sometimes we'll have a Sunday evening service, which is only a Q&A time. I won't preach at all, and we'll have a open Q&A on Sunday night, and you can
imagine that.
Yeah. And
what a concept.
Yeah, the church isn't about me. It's about the living word, Christ. So, and if I can help, if we can discuss it and air some difficult questions, or there was some idea, and I always encourage them of this, if you have a little notepad or something with you, scribble down any time you have a question when I'm teaching, so that when those times come up, you'll have it and you can bring it up and we'll get answers to it, hopefully, or we'll just dig deeper, So it's been really cool and really helpful. And I have a small church, so it's easier for me to do that. With a small country church of 30 people or something, it's really simple to do that. But when you have large kind of CEO pastor driven churches where you got 1,000 people listening to you or watching you on a screen, you just can't do that kind of stuff. It's more of a Sunday school kind of a deal then. So, yeah.
Wow, well, that's interesting. So you feel good about it? Sounds like you feel good about it. This is would you use the word successful? That your effort to do this on a local church level has been successful. That you haven't had half your congregation leave and want to burn you at the stake and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, no. like I said, they trust me. This has been over, years' time easing them into this kind of thing, and I think it's been successful. But again, I can't stress enough the patience with this. I mean, the academic context is one thing, but the church context is a whole nother thing. And so you got to be real careful and pastoral and walk people through these types of big paradigmatic ideas that kind of shift the way you look at Bible and the way you treat these texts. Because a lot of these folks some of these folks have been in church for 40 years and their theology's set. And so to kind of inch them out of it and lead them out of that real slowly is sometimes can be a painful process,
Yeah.
So,
well, I'm going to find out a little bit, what this is like as far as the, with the release of the books. We're
Right.
not, nobody knows. I mean, we can sit here in the office, and we frequently do, guess as to what reaction's going to be, but you're not going to know until they're out there, and they've got 5 or 6 months, behind them, and we'll see, who loves it, who hates it, and who's indifferent.
yeah.
It'll develop, and we'll learn something, about how to do something with the content. So yeah, one more question. Now you mentioned your research in Genesis 15:5 and that, and of course that again relating to your thesis and whatnot. What are some other things that sort of are on your radar that you are looking forward to diving into in relation to anything that we would loosely call divine counsel stuff that you could see yourself jumping into and studying at some other point?
Mike, the list is too long.
Well, just give us three or give us 3 or 4. Give us that in a sentence, and then maybe 2 or 3 sentences of explaining what that is or why you think that's interesting.
Okay, yeah, I can give a couple examples. So a lot of my research on my own and, through papers has been connecting these ideas in Paul, but also I want to do this more with the Gospels. So just one more thing in Paul I'll mention, and then something in the Gospels. So in Paul, I want to explore more the Romans issues and connect more. I didn't have time to do this in my paper, but I want to do this further, probably in my dissertation, is connect these ideas to Paul's glory Christology and the idea of glorification in Paul, and that actually being a term connected to these divine counsel idea of astral glory and the bright shiningness of these beings in the Old Testament, and understanding that the titles like the holy ones that they're given frequently, the divine counsel in the Old Testament, Paul uses these titles, holy ones, to call the community who already has the pneuma or the pneuma, the Spirit. So that he already calls them, if they're partakers of the Spirit and baptized into Christ or in Christ, the Pauline metaphor of salvation is in Christ, not metaphor, but ontologically for him, having the Spirit, that you're already holy ones.
Right.
And so you're waiting, like, for example, in Romans 8, you're waiting on the apocalypse, the revelation of the sons of God, you holy ones that I've called you before, when the whole cosmos knows that you're the actual sons of God. And this is attached to glorified, the idea of being glorified. And so I think the glory language is coming off of these kinds of celestial or astral glorification ideas. And this is how Paul is talking about the upcoming, the current and the revealing of the deification of the believer. And in the Gospels, I found something really interesting years ago and didn't really make the divine counsel connection till more recently, probably in the past year or so, is, in the Gospels, you have this title given to Jesus by the spirit beings that isn't given to him by any humans. And it's son of the Most High. Right. And, you're familiar with these, and we've talked about these texts before, but something very interesting about these texts is there's been an ongoing, and you're familiar with this, Mike, this ongoing debate about, do the synoptic gospels actually teach the pre-existence of Christ?
Right.
This has been a major debate for years in modern, specifically Western scholarship, and Simon Gathercole a few years back tried to approach the question by suggesting, this is Simon Gathercole at Cambridge, New Testament scholar, tried to approach it by suggesting that the "I am sent" passages are talking about him coming from heaven. Mm-hmm. But the problem with that thesis is that language is so often used in prophetic commissioning,
right?
That prophets say, "I am sent, I am sent." Just because there's angels that say it too doesn't definitively argue the preexistence of Christ from those texts. I mean, you'd have to connect it with a lot of other ideas, and I think one of these ideas is this title, "Son of the Most High," because only the demons or the spirits call Jesus that, and it's after his baptism when he receives the Spirit. And so this notion that they know who this Son of Most High, which the Hebrew equivalent, Son of El Elyon, which is the title of the chief of the council, so which is Yahweh, the chief of the council. There's all these other beings, and they know this kind of secondary figure. Call him the angel of Yahweh, call him Yahweh's wisdom, call him Yahweh's name. You develop this in your book a lot of the name and the wisdom, which you have great sections on that. But that figure, the council knows this figure. The council know the beings in that spiritual realm, the unseen realm, already know this figure. And so when that title is used by those spirit beings to address Jesus, I think that is a good concept of his pre-existence. And not only that, I think I would like to explore that more and research that more. But not only that, there's something very interesting connected to that title as well, where you get this idea that it's not just Jesus experiencing this glorification and deification, but it's actually the believers as well. And Jesus actually, I think, in Luke's Sermon on the Plain, gives us an idea about this, because he says, after he gets through a moral discourse, he says, those that obey these rules, he says, they will be called sons of the Most High.
Mm-hmm. Plural, yeah.
Plural.
Yeah.
That they will be. This is something that is going to happen to them. And so, you connect this idea with, and I don't have time to get into all of this, but the short version is you connect this with the idea of, say, the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, that seeing God is something that's future, that they will see God and live. And this is an Old Testament concept. If you see God, you die. Humans, creatures, if you even set foot on the mountain, you're toast. You don't see God and live. But in the Old Testament, say examples like Exodus 24.
Yeah, unless you're invited and all that. Yeah.
You have to be invited up the mountain, and you see God and you live, and you're actually, in some sense, in his heavenly temple, as if you were part of the council, and you eat with him. And not surprisingly, Jesus is hosting miraculous feast and saying that they will be called sons of the Most High. So I think this is early Jesus tradition that's looking forward to this deification of the true sons of Israel, the true sons of God, who will one day usurp these spirit beings who, when Jesus sends out the 70, they come back saying that we have authority over these beings.
Yep. Yeah. It's a good foretaste, and of course the theological messaging there is pretty clear. If you have, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview in your head, I mean, those aren't dots that are hard to connect.
Exactly.
I'm curious, with the sending thing, because you're obviously the text you just referenced deal with sonship. Of course, then there's the aspect of mission. Why was this son sent? And you get into all that. But have you looked at or considered yet Isaiah 9:5, 9:5, 9:6? I guess it's 9:5 in particular in the Septuagint versification. That passage in the Septuagint. We're familiar with Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Prince of Peace, and all that. Handel's Messiah, but the Septuagint doesn't say any of that. I'm just wondering if you've looked at that, because what the Septuagint says there is the figure, the quote unquote messianic figure there is called megales boules angelos, the messenger of the Greek.
Oh yes, council. I'm looking at it right now. Yeah.
So there you have a clear. I think you have a clearer message, messenger idea, and you have a direct, explicit council reference there, and that I think pretty easily suggests pre-existence. But I'm just wondering if you could tie that in at some point, because that's an interesting passage. You can't. What you're going to find when you get into that is there's no mechanical explanation in terms of textual criticism. You can't really get there. So that he either has a different text, or it's a very, again, interpretive rendering, possibly based on some other concatenation of traditions that wind up expressing that idea in the Septuagint.
Yeah, that's I have in the past with Daniel Street. We had done a seminar, just me and one other student with him, on early Jewish and monotheism and Christology, and this is one of the passages that we looked at. And I for the life of me, I can't remember some of those conversations now, but that's something I definitely need to look into, and tying that concept in with the Jesus tradition. I just haven't done that yet, but that's fascinating. I definitely have to look into this.
Well, we should wrap this up. You've given us an hour, and we're grateful for that. Again, the purpose here is just to get people exposed to you, so that they know that Mike isn't the only one.
Right. He's not the only one that's crazy.
Yeah. There are other people out there that are quite a ways into this, and again, we run into each other at academic conferences and whatnot, and we sort of, eventually you kind of find each other because people wind up in the same sessions and talking about the same things and Q&A, that kind of thing. You start to just sort of pick up on where people are at and how much they're tracking on different things. And I just think it's useful to have the audience exposed to somebody else that sees so much of this and is really making it a pursuit. And in your case, really trying to deliver, some of the content, to people who aren't as geeky as us. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah.
So thanks.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, this was a great discussion. I believe I can speak for all our listeners that this episode, and I just popped some popcorn, sat back, and just soaked it in. I mean, this is good stuff. It's a treat to hear two guys like y'all talk about this content, and we certainly appreciate it. And Dave, before you go, I can't resist to gang up on Mike, but are you a Dallas Cowboys fan?
I'm not an NFL fan at all, actually.
Okay,
so
you don't want to be in our fantasy league.
Well, no, I was just, my point is, since Mike's a Packer, I was just going to ask if you think Dez Bryant caught that ball.
Well, I'll tell you what, because I'm in Dallas and I'm on a national podcast, I'll say that he did.
Okay, good. Good. I guess I'll go ahead and release the podcast, because otherwise I was going to have to delete.
Yeah. That's probably the Dallas Cowboys fans with pitchforks coming at you.
Yeah. No, Dave, what about your church you're associated with? Would you like to tell people in the DFW area? Maybe they can come and check you out. I mean, if you're spending 3 years on Luke and you have QA nights, that's a church I'd like to go to.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, it's not in the DFW area. It's actually up north. I'm a bivocational pastor, so it's up right near the Red River on the Oklahoma border. Really, Arthur City is right outside of Paris, Texas, and like just a little country church. And I've tried to stay faithful to that, because a lot of folks that I see going into church ministry at a seminary, they get the little church and they work their way up, kind of deal. And I've tried to stay faithful. I've been at that church for 5.5 years, and I commute every weekend from Dallas, which is long, but I love them. And during the week I work at Dallas Seminary Book Center. So,
oh, well, great. Do you have a website or blog or in Twitter that people can find you and learn more about you?
Yeah, you can. I keep in touch with a lot of scholars and friends on Facebook. You can Facebook me at David Burnett. You'll find me. I'm the bald guy, so it's hard to miss. I'm friends with Mike Heiser, so you can find me through him. And I do have a biblio blog called The Time Has Been Shortened, and we have not kept that up. Me and a couple other good friends had started it years ago, and we really, when you get into research and you're pastoring and you're working, if it's not quality content, we don't want to put it on there. So we just kind of backed off the blogging thing for a little bit. I use it to put out news, and I'm probably going to start it up again soon. But Facebook is probably the best way to contact me. And you can email me at dburnett51@yahoo.com. Just kind of my general mailbox. You can send stuff if you'd like. And I'd love to talk more with y'all about it. And anyone who's interested in my research, I'd love to talk about it. And so,
are you on Twitter? Do you have a Twitter account?
I never use Twitter. I'm more of a
Okay.
Facebook person, but yeah, Facebook's the best way to do it. I have a Twitter, but if you send me something on Twitter, I'm probably not going to see it because I don't check it often. So
Okay.
Okay, well, we certainly appreciate you taking the time to do the show, and we look forward to having you back on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I look forward to it as well. Thanks, guys.
I'll see you in November.
Yep, we'll see you in November. I got another paper on Luke 22, so you got to be there.
Okay.
All right.
All right, Mike. Well, next week we'll be doing our 5th Q&A, and I just want to remind everybody that we're answering those questions as I get them. So just please know that eventually we will get to your questions, and then after that, Mike, we're going to jump into Leviticus. That'll be exciting.
Yep, that's correct. I know everyone's just pining away, just clamoring, to study Leviticus.
Well, that's going to be intense.
You're going to get what you didn't ask for.
Well, I'm looking forward to it personally. All right.
Yeah.
Well, we would like to thank our guest, David Burnett, for joining us this week. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.